Hello, this is part one of my commentary to accompany your reading of Chapter 8, Language Classification. This marks the beginning of the second half of the course, which I told you was going to be very different from the first half. In the first half, we tended to look at language data in isolation and learn how syntax, phonetics, phonology, morphology, how these things worked, kind of extracted from the very people who use them. In part two of the course, we look at language in a more macro way, taking into account populations and other features of the people that actually use languages. Chapter 8 is called Language Classification, and we'll have a series of recordings to give you my commentary for Chapter 8. And we'll roughly want to cover the following things. First, how do we define a language in the classification sense? What is the difference between a language and a dialect? And this can be different from popular ways of referring to those things. We'll look at the case of dying languages. And what that tells us in our sort of scientific study of language. How can we classify different languages of the world according to types of phonologies or syntaxes or morphologies, right? So different shapes kind of across the world's languages in a nutshell. We will talk about how languages are sometimes classified genetically and what that means when we say genetically. And then we will take just a brief look at the Indo-European family, which is the name given to the broad family of languages that English belongs to. Okay, so first, a very important concept when we're determining the difference between a language and a dialect is that of mutual intelligibility. You know, we like our nerdy words in linguistics, and this one is actually very helpful. Mutual intelligibility is the degree to which linguistic varieties can be understood by speakers. So it means if I'm talking to you and I'm speaking what I speak and you're speaking what you speak, and we're able to converse and understand each other, then you and I are mutually intelligible and we're speaking something that is mutually intelligible. Even if I'm from the Deep South and you are from Boston, for instance, we can still have a conversation. So other examples of mutually intelligible varieties of English might be the English of Toronto, Canada. So those speakers sound a certain way, but they can have conversations with the people of London, UK, or Chicago, the US. So we would call all of these dialects of the same language, right? So and again, I like to bring up the Martians. What would the Martians say? As they're the most objective onlookers, observing all of the languages of the world, and the language structures and similarities, how they sound, the words used, and they would point to all of those Englishes and say, yeah, those are pretty much the same thing. They have some differences, but they're just different dialects of the same language. Okay. Now, conversely, the Martians would look at French, so people speaking French, and people speaking Italian, and they would kind of see it the other way around. There are many similarities between French and Italian because they are genetically related, or they have a shared history, a shared ancestor, if you will, linguistically and historically. However, they are not mutually intelligible. There are certain words that are shared in common and even certain grammatical structures. However, a person speaking French cannot generally carry on a conversation with a person who's speaking back to them in Italian, unless, of course, like they both speak each other's language. But that's not the point, right? That's not the same thing as mutual intelligibility. Mutual intelligibility would mean that you don't speak each other's language, but you can still understand each other. So if they don't speak each other's variety or each other's language, French and Italian speakers cannot carry on a very successful conversation because those languages are not mutually intelligible. Therefore, they are not dialects of the same language, but rather they are separate, different languages. Okay? Now, this sounds like a really nice litmus test to tell us if, two linguistic varieties, two things, are dialects of the same language or separate languages. However, in the real world, it actually gets pretty fuzzy. And there are numerous examples where even trying to apply mutual intelligibility as a metric doesn't get us a really firm answer as to whether two things are in common enough to be the same language or if they're separate languages. And there are other factors that confound our evaluation of shared similarities. So here are a few real-world examples, but we can actually find many more. Serbian and Croatian, according to the Martian linguists, could be considered dialects of the same language. They share a great deal of similarity, but the speaker groups are culturally, and in many cases, like physically and historically, so separated from each other that this can interfere with their ability to communicate using their respective dialects or their speaking their respective codes. Okay. I'll show you a map with a case of Dutch and German. Now, it is the case that modern standard Dutch that is taught in schools is a separate language from modern standard German that is taught in German schools. However, these countries, the Netherlands and Germany, share a huge amount of historic overlap and changing of borders and shared cultural identity. And we'll see on a map how, as you go into different dialect areas, it becomes very fuzzy where Dutch ends and German begins, and vice versa. And then a final example, which I'm going to have you listen to a recording of on the Sakai site, is a fun example of Gullah English, which is spoken off the coast of the Carolinas. And that is a special problem of Creoles and context. But in a nutshell, lots of real-world factors interfere with the application of mutual intelligibility as a test for languagehood or dialecthood. Things like social, political, geographic, even religious factors can interfere with the determination of linguistic boundaries. So here's a map of that German example. And in blue, in the darkest blue, we can see the Netherlands, and in the orange and red areas, that is Germany. Part of that is Switzerland, where a variety of German is also spoken. But I want you to look at the border between the Netherlands and Germany. So where that blue meets with some of the yellow. And the numbers on these regions are known dialect regions where people have an accent of that region. And so where we see, in particular, dialect area 15 and 5, if you're close to that border on the Dutch side, you speak something that is mutually intelligible with the German spoken on the other side of that border, a mile or two away, because historically those were grouped differently before the modern nationhood of Germany and the Netherlands. And so this is a classic kind of historic and geographic reason to explain why mutual intelligibility is more complicated than just a yes/no litmus test. Is German mutually intelligible with Dutch? Well, no, except all these caveats, right? Except which dialect are we talking about, or which dialects? Okay. So, how many different languages are there in the world today? In your textbook, around 6,000. And why don't we have some exact number? There's a few reasons for that. One, of course, is the problem of classification, and there are still plenty of examples where we're not sure if we're dealing with different dialects or separate languages. The other answer for that is that we actually haven't worked with every single place where languages are spoken. So there are still undiscovered languages in the world, particularly in remote areas, for example, in Pacific Islands that are very hard to get to. Now, at least 2,000 of these languages have tiny groups of speakers and are known to have fewer than 1,000 speakers. And according to your textbook, around 50% of the world's languages are known to be threatened with extinction, which is alarming but also fraught and controversial. Why is that accelerating? Largely because of globalization, lingua francas, increases in education. There are reasons for that extinction that are quite unfortunate, but there are reasons that also are arguably positive, right? So that's a very sticky discussion that we will get into actually in the next slideshow. I want to show you a list from a wonderful source called ethnologue.com, which has a lot of good, firm census counts from many different groups, cultures. And so what I have on this slide and the next slide are the 25 top languages in the world today according to numbers of speakers. And this may surprise you. So if we were in class, I would say, tell me which languages in the world are doing the best, or have the greatest number of living speakers. And many of you would say Chinese. And it's important at this point to make sure that you know, as many people don't know, China actually has many languages spoken within it. And what is called Chinese is actually a group of languages. So the standard language of education, society, and the media in most of mainland China is Mandarin. So it's important to extract that separately. But there are many other languages spoken in China that have large, important numbers of speakers. So Mandarin is at the top with going on 1 billion speakers. And we also have information from that table about the language family and the percentage of the world population that speaks it. This should be the most recent data that's available. Spanish comes in second, and we know of many, many countries where Spanish is the native language. And English is third. So English is doing well. And then it's unclear, what you may have said for number 4, but people tuning into geography and geopolitical developments wouldn't be too surprised to learn that it's Hindi, one of the major languages of India. India, as a nation, has many languages, including official languages. Hindi is just one of them, but it does have the largest number of speakers. Bengali is another Indian language spoken in a different region. So these are huge speaker populations. Hindi and Bengali have some similarity, but these are separate languages that are not mutually intelligible. And then you see the rest on that slide. Let's see. Western Punjabi, also Indian. Marathi and Telugu, I'm sure I'm saying those badly, are also Indian languages. And then rounding out our top 25, we have another Chinese language called Wu. Turkish, Korean, French, German, Vietnamese. Tamil is another Indian language, another Chinese language. And then, so we only get to things like Italian, one of the Arabics, until we're, 22, 23. So remember that I just said there are many languages spoken in China. When we think of the language Arabic, we tend to think of a monolithic single thing as well. And so, again, when I ask that question, what is the most spoken language, or what are the most spoken languages in the world, people will often say Arabic, right? Because they're thinking about the whole Arabic-speaking world, which is huge and has many, many speakers. However, that runs into exactly the kind of issue that belongs in chapter 8, because the Arabic spoken in one country is called Arabic. So, for example, Egyptian Arabic and, what's another good example? Algerian Arabic or Moroccan Arabic are actually different. They're different enough that they are not mutually intelligible. Okay, so the speakers can't easily speak to each other. And this is interesting when people embark on learning Arabic for the State Department or for military or intelligence use. If you say, I speak Arabic, I will ask which Arabic, because you have to choose one and stick with it. There are many Arabics, is what I'm saying. Okay, and finally, just a preview of the next video in this series. Next, we'll talk about kind of the other end of the spectrum, so endangered languages, languages that for which we've documented the death or the disappearance, right? So we'll talk about what that process looks like, what are common reasons why languages die out, and what exactly is lost when languages are no longer spoken. We will look at a couple of cases in point, so examples of extinct and endangered languages, and we will discuss and hopefully have some forum debate about government and societal efforts to preserve dying languages. What is good? What is not good? Is it worthwhile? Things like that. So stay tuned.